Hey guys, I'm Chris Buck and a very warm welcome to Friday Fretworks, and this week, Gibson's Darkest Days. Such is the quality of even entry-level instruments in this day and age that, thankfully, it is becoming increasingly rare to come across a guitar that is an absolute dog, let alone your first guitar. However, a few days ago I was watching an episode of the Gibsons collection series with the brilliant Charlie Starr from Blackberry Smoke and came across this quote.
What was the first real guitar that you had growing up?
I saved up, it's a few $100s and bought a 1978 SG. With the harmonica bridge and horrible. No, I'm not poo-pooing on all of
that
1978,
whole era,
but this one in particular I wanted it to be great.
Yeah.
Because it was within reach and I was able to save up $300 and get it. But it just never was great.
But funnily enough, it was actually only a few weeks ago that I played one of those 70s Gibson SGs with that harmonica bridge for the first time, and not to go leaping on a bandwagon here, but it was terrible. How much of that can be attributed to, I don't know, bad setup, or maybe just needing a little bit of work here and there? I'm not entirely sure, but there was nothing about that guitar that particularly inspired any confidence that lurking in there somewhere was a gem, or even a halfway competent guitar. It was just a bit crap, unfortunately, for want of a better phrase, which, without labouring the point, I don't think it would be of a great revelation to anyone to say that the 1970s aren't or weren't considered Gibson's greatest decade. 1969 saw the company sold to the Norlin Corporation, and a succession of increasingly less desirable changes to Gibson's lineup. It's widely thought of as the era of 10, 11, sometimes even 12-pound Les Pauls. Wider headstocks, headstock velours, pancake bodies, three-piece maple necks, etc., all of which were a marked departure from the construction techniques which had typified Gibson's golden era. Now, interestingly, it's also thought of as the era of mini humbuckers, which I think is probably fair to say suffered by association with a fairly dark time, not just for Gibson but for guitar manufacture in general. It's no coincidence that a pre-CBS Strat or Telecaster will set you back considerably more than a guitar made by Fender only 5 or 6 years later. But is this reputation as substandard instruments deserved or entirely unjustified? After all, for every Norlin nightmare, there were a plethora of players who relied on 70s Les Pauls. Lindsey Buckingham, Randy Rhoads, Scott Gorham, Pete Townsend, and Alex Lifeson, to just literally name but a few. Now, believe it or not, given the proliferation of 70s Gibsons that you will probably find in most second-hand guitar stores, I think I've only ever actually played one or two, which, relative to the incredible amount of bursts or 50s gold tops or early 60s ES guitars that I've been lucky enough to play over the years, I didn't really feel as though I had any authority to speak on these guitars. So, took a trip up the M5 to ATB Guitars in Cheltenham here in the UK to check out a few of the incredible number of 70s Gibsons that they actually have in stock at the moment. And to quote the Gibsons collection series, what you're about to see may shock you. Quickly, just before we go on, a very quick piece of housekeeping. You probably will have noticed I'm away again in another branch of Premier Inn somewhere in the country. I don't live in Premier Inns, although I probably could do at this point, to be honest. But I'm away with Cardinal Black. And speaking of Cardinal Black, today, June 21st, 2024, sees the release of Live the Memo, our first ever live record. It's a particularly special, meaningful record for me. It was actually recorded at a memorial show that we played for my old man who passed away last year. So it's very cool to see it actually released. The pre-order response was incredible. It's available on vinyl and CD, as well as actually everywhere digitally now, anywhere you ordinarily consume music. But as I said, it's released today, so if you want to check that out, it's a particularly good moment to do so, I guess. Speaking of Cardinal Black, we're doing some shows in the US as well next month, playing a festival in Omaha, Nebraska, playing with Fire. We're also playing the Basement East in Nashville and the Troubadour in Los Angeles. Both of those last shows actually have, I think, maybe 40 or 50 tickets left before they are sold out, which is truly mind-boggling. So if you fancy coming to see us and you're in those neck of the woods, all the links down in the description box. Anyway, on with the video. So, my first impressions of these guitars. Now, unsurprisingly, they're heavy. Not unusably so, it's worth pointing out. Most of them are comfortably in the £10 range somewhere. One or two actually creeping into the high nines. But relative to every burst that I've ever played, and I'm not saying that's the exclusive point of comparison here, I'm just using it as a reference point for a little bit of context in the time. Most of those were in the maybe mid-8s, somewhere around that, one or two creeping into the low 9s. So I guess straight away, if you picked up one of these guitars off the shelf at the time, they felt a world away from those lightweight, kind of vibrant, lively guitars that Gibson were trying to recreate the posthumous success of, thanks to the likes of Eric Clapton or Mike Bloomfield or Peter Green or Billy Gibbons, any number of players that made those bursts a success after their days. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, there were also a whole host of feature changes around this time which set them apart from Gibson's golden era. Notably, the wider headstock, the headstock volute introduced in 1969 as a means of trying to minimise headstock breaks, obviously traditionally a fairly weak point for most Gibson guitars, three-piece maple necks post-1975, and perhaps most controversially, the pancake bodies, essentially a construction method which involves using a thinner piece of maple sandwiched between two thinner, cheaper pieces of mahogany. But all of these features together and you can paint a pretty vivid picture of a company and a new ownership doing their best to tighten their belts by cutting costs and maybe cutting corners. Far be it from me to say, but as a consequence, 70s Gibsons have never really had a great reputation, either then or now. But what are they like as guitars? Now, obviously, it is somewhat unfair to try and speak for an entire era of instruments based on playing just 7 or 8 or 9 of them over the years, but to speak in incredibly broad strokes for a second, the most consistent thing about these 70s Gibsons that I've just played was their inconsistency. Some were good, some were less than good, and based on that 70s SG that I played a few weeks ago, not at ATB, it's worth pointing out, some were incredibly poor. And one of the guitars I played at ATB was actually marked as a factory second, though admittedly you would be hard pushed to see why. And ironically, it was probably my pick of the bunch, despite being the only guitar there to feature that much maligned 3-piece maple neck. Again, to reference those fabled bursts for a second, as much as their reputation far outstrips their attributes as guitars these days, inevitably so given their price tag, in the 16 or maybe 17 that I've played, I've never actually played a bad one, never played one that really struck me as a Friday afternoon job, as it were, which relative to my limited experience of 70s Gibsons isn't something I could say for those guitars. Admittedly, none of them really overtly struggled with substandard quality control or anything so drastic, but some of them just felt a bit lifeless. Maybe it was their sheer boat anchor weight sat on my lap that kind of impacted my thinking somewhat, but every great guitar that I've ever played has kind of felt like a two-way relationship, whereas playing some of these just felt like hitting a lifeless ball against a spongy wall. There wasn't that dynamic response or spark or character that you want from a good or a great guitar. They just felt a bit meh. One definite highlight, however, were the Mini Humbuckers in the 73 Deluxe. I think it's probably fair to say, as I said earlier, the Mini Humbuckers kind of struggled with association with a fairly dark point in Gibson's history, but by comparison to the full-size humbuckers that Gibson were using around this time, which in my experience can sound a little cloudy or vague, Mini Humbuckers have got character, they have got spark, and this dynamic energy in response that really sets them apart. I've actually done a video on Mini Humbuckers in the past, which I shall link to below, but based on sound alone, this 73 Deluxe was an undoubted standout. So what's the conclusion? As I said, I'm kind of loath to try and speak definitively on an entire era, an entire decade of instruments, based on playing less than 10 of them, but honestly, unfortunately, it is easy to see why Charlie Starr had such strong, vivid, miserable memories of that 78 SG, especially for an instrument that's as pivotal as your first real guitar. That's a fairly important moment. Comparatively, it's easy to see why Pete Townsend loved Les Paul Deluxes. It very much seemed to be an era of extremities, from deadweight duds to comatose customs to dynamic deluxes. Honestly, what you got seemed entirely dependent not only on your spec choice, but luck of the draw and when it was made, which is never a great starting point for any manufacturer, not just guitar manufacturing. I guess ultimately, if you are looking to buy a 70s Gibson, apply the same caveat emptor approach that you would apply to buying literally anything else, just maybe a touch more judiciously. Now I'm going to play you out now on a 71 Les Paul Deluxe that I borrowed from Vintage and Rare Guitars in Bath a few months ago that, despite its less than desirable specs, was a truly fantastic instrument. Don't judge a book by its cover, or, apparently, a guitar by its construction methods. I'm going to play you out now, but as ever, thank you very much for watching. I'm Chris Buck, this is Friday Fretworks. Please subscribe, hit the bell icon if you haven't already, and I shall see you next week for another episode. Cheers guys, take care, see you soon.